Is it really worth upgrading to the new EB410.2? Let's crack into my build review and see if it's really worth it. Rich here from the RCNetwork.com, and today we have a pretty cool video lined up for you. This is my full build review of the brand new Tekno EB410.2. Of course, that is Tekno's newest 1/10 scale 4-wheel drive electric competition buggy. Now, in this build review, we'll be going over lots of different topics, including tools needed to assemble your EB, parts left over from the kit, how the owner's manual really is, the actual differences between the 410 and the 410.2. I have mine on hand to compare it side by side, my overall thoughts of this kit, and what the kit's really missing. A couple of my thoughts on how this kit went together and what it's missing in the kit. Also, 2 future videos that will be going over the full reveal. That means everything fully ready to run on this EB410.2. And finally, a running video at OCRC, my local track. As with all of my build reviews, this is everything you get inside the box, fully assembled and ready for electronics, paint, and wheels and tires. So let's just jump into this. Some of the tools required to assemble your EB410.2 is a good set of hex wrenches, including a 1.5, 2.0, and 2.5 millimeter hex wrench, a 5.5 and 7.0 nut driver, a good set of needle nose pliers, a good sharp hobby knife, and some Lexan scissors just to trim some parts and cut out the body. Supplemental tools that definitely help the build are a 3.5 millimeter arm reamer, a body reamer, 2 open-ended turnbuckle wrenches from Tekno, a 5.5, 5, and 4 millimeter is what I use. And finally, Tekno's shock shaft pliers are a great asset to get those shocks built up perfect. Fluids included in the kit was 600 CST shock fluid, 15,000, 30,000, and 10,000 diff fluid for the front, center, and rear. You do have some thread locker and some black grease. 2 items that I added to the build that just helped build it so much easier was some good old chapstick for building my turnbuckles and some of this Avid slop. This is actually their O-ring grease for building up the shocks and putting plenty of it on those X-rings. Parts left over from the kit are some motor bolts that I'll mount my motor up with. You do have 2 different spline servo horns, both 23, 24. I mounted up a 25. You do have the included motor fan mount and the hardware to mount it. You do have a regular sized servo mount. I installed the low profile servo mount. All of the pills up here for the new 3.5 millimeter suspension pins for the car. You do have some roll center inserts here for the rear hubs. You have 2 different diff shims, 1 millimeter and 2 millimeter. You do have the second rear chassis brace. The stock setting is to mount only the longer one. You do have the inserts to also adjust for the diff shims over here. You do have a 10 millimeter block for the rear wing. You have the rear sway bar mount if you choose to mount it in the traditional setting. More on that a little bit later. Some servo shims right there, some extra hardware, an extra piece for a sway bar, and this thing that I have no clue what it is. It looks like an owl face. Didn't see that anywhere in the owner's manual. Taking a look at the owner's manual for the EB410.2, it's just like all of the other Tekno owner's manuals. It's good. Probably the best owner's manual that I've seen in any RC vehicle. So they do a lot of great things, not only with the illustrations, but a lot of written content went into this owner's manual, just giving you tips and tricks and almost explaining why they're doing things, which is pretty nice. One thing to note in this owner's manual, they do give 1-to-1 diagrams here, unlike a certain vehicle I just previously built. They also give you lots of different notes in here on things. Definitely pay attention to these. I sometimes highlight them as I go through to just point out some things that I thought were pretty cool or things that I had questions about down the line to point out to you guys. The first thing to point out when you're building your EB410.2 is on these screws that actually affix to the diff case. So the top of the diff case going out to the main portion of the diff case, they do say to go ahead and tighten them all the way down and then back them off a quarter turn. turn. I know a lot of people, when they were building their EB410s, they complained of clicking or diffs that were just too tight. This is the reason. Just backing that off a quarter turn, everything is smooth. Another thing I highlighted here was the specific instructions on setting up your sway bars. They give a note here to screw these screws in gently until they just touch the sway bar, then back off just slightly to let the sway bar free. I think this is a great tip. I didn't see it in the previous gen of the EB, and it's nice that they added it. A lot of people just getting into the hobby don't quite know these tips, and it's nice that they include that in the owner's manual. Another thing I saw in this owner's manual versus the previous gen was some explanation here of some of the inserts. They're giving lots of different degrees and explanations of what the different dots do on the pill inserts. Also here on the flip side for the roll center, they give you just a diagram here explaining what each one does. Flipping over to page 12 here, we notice a written note for the king pins. Now the king pins go in at slightly weird angles, so they actually suggest to pre-thread them in. So in other words, just to thread them in without having everything connected. That way when you go to actually attach everything, you line up the threads perfectly and you don't have a problem with getting them kind of cockeyed in. So a good tip there. Another thing that I pointed out in the previous gen was they do a great job of these turnbuckle ends. They give you like a T on one side that actually is the Tekno logo, and that's the actual part that goes on the upper part of the ball end. So pushing these in is a no-brainer. You just have to line up where the T's are. It's all set to go. One thing that really amazes me is in Tekno's owner's manual, they give not only written instructions to fill the shocks, but also a diagram here to show you how to do what they listed up here. So it's pretty cool. I found other vehicles and other manufacturers that just don't give any written explanation. They try and live by the diagrams to explain it, and it just doesn't do a good job. So kudos to Tekno for actually including that. Another thing is also the 16-inch drill bit is not needed for these shock caps. They're already pre-drilled. I didn't find that I needed to drill those out. One thing I noticed in this EB was they actually started with a low profile mount initially. I think in the previous gen they had the low profile mount like in bag O, it was like the optional bag, and they didn't have clear directions on if you chose to mount it here to look way back throughout the owner's mount or to figure out how to mount it. There's also an issue with the actual linkage to mount everything up, so this actually clarifies everything now, and they're still including both mounts, which is a good thing. They did up the torque specs. I think in the previous version it said 150 ounce. This one actually recommends 180 ounce or more for a low profile servo. Last but not least, in the owner's manual, Tekno does a great job of listing all of the different parts right here on the one side, and then just setup information to let you know what ride height is, what camber, front toe, Ackerman effect, droop. And then on the flip side here, they actually give you more setup information for springs, pistons, sway bars, wheelbase adjustments, everything you need to know for your new vehicle. So overall on the manual, Tekno did a great job here. I didn't have any errors in the manual and no missing parts, which is a good thing. Now during this section of the video, we're going to be comparing all the differences between the 410 versus the 410.2. Now keep in mind during this section, of course, my 410 is fully outfitted with a lot of upgrades and of course electronics, so keep that in mind when you're viewing this section. And as far as the guide, we're going to be going straight down the side of the box as far as all of the revisions, the new, ultra, and revised items that Tekno has included. And at the end of this section, we'll also go over some things that I noticed that they didn't list that I saw that were a little bit different. First off, Tekno revised the chassis. Now this is using a 7075 CNC'd aluminum, so a little bit harder aluminum, so it gives a little bit longer wear characteristics. Now one thing that was also noted is they used the keyed section right here for the A block going into the chassis, so you do have to loosen those two screws holding the A block on to kind of key it in. It kind of locks it in place. The original 410 did not have that, but the ET410 did. Now probably one of the biggest updates that Tekno made was they're using larger 3.5 millimeter HD hinge pins and revised hinge pin inserts. So all those little pills that go into the A, B, C, and D blocks, those have all been revised to use 3.5 millimeter HD hinge pins, which is pretty cool. Now it's hard to see the difference up close here on the actual 410.2, but they're definitely there. I just compared a little caliper size there of the hinge pins, and they're definitely different. I did see a model model change on the A, B, C, and D block. They're all denoted by a HD at the end of the model number. I didn't see a physical difference in the A, B, C, and D block, but they definitely have different model numbers. Flipping the buggies around, next we're going to talk about the taller, stronger one-piece wing mount and height adjustments. Now on the new one, the 410.2, it is a one-piece design. The previous version actually had two different sides here. It didn't really have a centerpiece that kind of brought it all together. So definitely a stronger piece. This is all molded plastic, all one piece. Nothing had to be put together. And they're also including these kind of riser blocks now. This is the 5mm version, I believe it is. There's also a 10mm version that is included in the kit. Now taking a look at the 410 version, you can definitely see how thin these things are. Maybe it was a weight savings thing originally, but they're definitely flexy, especially when you start landing upside down like a lot of us do. So next up was the shock revision. They actually changed the cartridge inside of the bottom of the shock here. So a lot of upgrades that you saw in the past was adding that plastic spacer between the two X-rings. I think MIP had a kit out for it, and they're actually including that now inside the cartridge. So pretty much you have X-ring, plastic spacer, X-ring, plastic spacer, and cap. So it's all built into one now, and I think we should have some pretty good experiences with these new shock cartridges. Also back to the shocks, Tekno mentions the ultra secure locking spring perch design. I didn't see a difference. They look identical to the 410 and also the ET410. So I don't see any kind of change on these. It's just a grub screw that goes through the bottom eyelet up to the spring perch. No difference there that I can see. Maybe someone can answer that down in the comment section. Another big change was on the rear end of this vehicle. Now right here you're seeing on the 410.2, shocks are mounted in the front, whereas the old version, shocks were mounted in the back. A lot of people were kind of flipping the arms and then adding the shocks up here. Well, Tekno kind of did it factory. They gave us a reverse sway bar and they just adjusted everything to make this perfectly fitting. And with that came newly designed rear arms. They're not only capable of mounting the shocks in the front now, but they also are thicker and more durable overall. Also added in the 410.2 is adjustable roll center on the rear hubs. Now it's controlled by two inserts that go on either side of the rear hub, allowing you to place the hub either lower or higher on the actual suspension arm, so thus giving you even more tunability of your 410.2. Looking at the front spindle carriers right here on the 410.2, these are new 15-degree LRC spindle carriers. They're actually notated on the plastic mold with the letters LRC, so a little bit different degree, just give you another option. The front camber plate on the 410.2 is a little bit beefier, and it's kind of keyed in to the front shock tower, so it gives you a little bit more durability, and it also acts as a bulkhead brace. Now I don't have a good example here on my 410 because I have the carbon shock tower, so you can see how much smaller this one is versus the thickness right here of the new 410.2. Although I've never stripped a Spur Gear on any of my 410 vehicles, Tekno decided to go ahead and change the material of the center differential Spur Gear. So they're giving us still an 81 tooth, but it used a revised material just to give it a little bit more durability. Although I have my 410 outfitted with a front sway bar, the original 410 did not come with a front sway bar, but now the 410.2 comes with both front and rear sway bars included in the box. Another update that kind of baffled me was it states it has large wheel bearings and 6mm HD stub axles. Now from the 410 to the 410.2, just comparing the owner's manual, I didn't see any difference in either bearing size or a model number change in the stub axles. They all appear to be the same. Maybe that's another question that can be answered down in the comment section. And the final change that was listed by Tekno was a newly optimized reverse Bellcrank steering system. Now we always knew that this was a reverse Bellcrank system, but they definitely tightened up the gussets right here. They're definitely smaller on this version versus the 410, and they've just tightened some of the tolerances, including this actual linkage right here that uses a 30mm grub screw versus an 18 in the previous. Now that we've gotten all the official upgrades and revisions done that Tekno mentioned, let's go over some of the other ones that I saw that I didn't see any mention of. So let's start off with the wheelbase wheelbase change. And I noticed just from my stock setup over here on the 410 versus the 410.2 stock, I noticed that the 410.2 is about 5 to 6 millimeters shorter wheelbase overall. I've made no changes to the wheelbase here on my stock 410, and the 410.2 is just a little bit shorter. Next up on the differentials, the 410 used a 15-15-7 spread for their differentials, where the 410.2 uses a 15-30-10. So quite a bit of difference, although no changes in the actual differentials. Talking more about that reverse Bellcrank system, they actually flip-flopped the way they have everything mounted. Now here on the 410, they had the aluminum nut on the top side and the screw on the bottom. They actually flipped that on the 410.2. So the aluminum nut was actually captured in top of one of the Bellcranks here, where this one is kind of free floating. So you do have to get in there with a 5.5 millimeter open and wrench to get this thing tightened down. Another change on the Bellcrank system were the steering posts. Now on the 410.2, you actually use a 2 millimeter hex wrench to tighten these down, where the old version used a 5 millimeter nut driver to drive these in. Now for the shock package, of course, we mentioned the included spacer now in between the two X rings, but another change on the shock package were the pistons. Now on the fronts, 1.2 millimeter 8-hole pistons are stock now on the 410.2, where the stock on the 410 was an asymmetrical, so it had two 1.7 millimeter holes and 4 smaller holes that were not denoted. They also used 600 weight on the new version versus 500 weight on the old 410. Same with the rears, 1.3 millimeter 8-hole pistons on the 410.2, and they use 1.8 asymmetrical once again on the rears on the 410. Oil stayed the same with 600 in the 410.2 and 500 on the 410. One last thing to note on the rear shock package only, they included this spacer right here, or this rubber O-ring. This rides on top of the bottom eyelet on the shock shaft, so it's somewhat going to limit the amount of travel that you have. I looked at the spacing here, 29 millimeters on the 410.2 versus 28 millimeters here on the 410. So a little bit different there as far as the travel. Just make a note of that when you're opening up the bags, because you'll have 2 extra O-rings there on the rears. Alright, so as far as the actual build, this build went together very nicely. Now, of course, I'm pretty accustomed to putting together Tekno kits, so I almost didn't need a manual except for the parts that were just slightly different. I've got to say, all the fit and finishes on this vehicle were absolutely awesome. The only thing that I still give Tekno a lot of crap for are these shock caps. They've definitely improved since the very first gen of the first 410, but they still are plastic and they're still a little bit of a pain to thread on. You kind of have to back off the threads to find where it kind of engages in. I had 2 that went on perfectly fine, and the other 2 gave me a little bit of a headache. Now, on the flip side of that, the actual bleeder screw has been improved. Now, I'm not sure if they improved the screw or the O-ring that goes on it, and you know exactly which O-ring that thing is. What a pain in the ass it was to get those O-rings on. The new ones have been improved. I'm not sure if they gave a little bit more elasticity to the O-ring, or they made the screw have a little bit more bite to it, but they went on so much more easier on the new 410.2. So with that, the 2 things that I think that the 410.2 should have came with, of course, the aluminum shock caps, or a drastic improvement to the plastic ones. Although I had like a 50% success rate on getting them on the first shot, it was still a little bit of a pain in the butt, and I think for some newbies out there, they're definitely going to cross-thread them. I know I cross-threaded one of my original ones way back when. Now, the other thing that I think every EB should come with is an aluminum servo horn. Now, I know it's hard to pick what servo horn that customer is going to need, but I think pretty much 25 is probably 85% of the industry now. There's only a couple that are holding on to 23s and very few on 24. So I think if Tekno were to throw in a 25 tooth spline aluminum servo horn, it would make a lot of customers happy. So those are the only 2 things I think this kit needs right out of the box, would be the aluminum shock caps and that aluminum servo horn. Well guys, that is my full build review of the brand new Tekno EB410.2. I can't wait to get this thing outfitted with some great electronics, and that'll be all shown in the next video, the actual reveal video, where you'll see the electronics, the wheels and tires, and of course how I painted the body up. So stay tuned for that video. And then after that, you will see a full running video of not only this vehicle but also my regular 410. We're going to take it over to OCRC, put some laps down, and compare the two vehicles. I'll have them bound to different remotes. Hopefully I can capture some great footage of not only my EB410, but the brand new EB410.2. Well guys, that is it for now. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the channel and give a like to this video. And if you have a question, leave that down in the comments section. Well guys, that is it for now. Comments, questions down below, and as always, thumbs up and subscribe. That's it for now guys. Over and out.